I was asked to say a few words about this upcoming conferences that some of you may have heard already. It's the annual Interspeech, and the next one will be in Asia, on the Indian subcontinent in Hyderabad. I would encourage you all to submit your papers. It's going to be a wonderful conference in a very, very interesting place. I've been to India once, not to the south as this one is in, but it's really a fascinating country with lots to see, and I highly encourage you to participate. I want to acknowledge my colleagues and co-authors in several of the publications we had on this general topic of human parity in speech recognition. It's a team effort, as you all know, especially in speech, where it's very interdisciplinary. So I will report on a lot of other people's work, and if I can't answer all the questions, I apologize, and I point you to some of the papers. Here's the roadmap. I will give you an overview of the history of conversational speech transcription, which is has been worked on for a long time in our field. Then I will tell you the story of what we wanted to achieve with this so-called human parity experiment. Then I will discuss the question of actually what is human performance on this task. It's an interesting question in itself, which has received a little bit of study in the literature. Then I will talk about our recognition system that we put together for the purpose of this experiment. And then the question of how can we compare what human transcribers do versus machine transcription with our ASR systems. How do they compare, not just in terms of the overall performance, but also qualitatively. And I will wrap up with some conclusions. The human parity experiment is an effort we started at Microsoft Research about 2 years ago. We were looking for a benchmark task to test our own technology and the technology at large that the field had come to. Conversational telephone speech was a benchmark task that had been worked on for a while. Many of us in our group in a previous life and previous jobs had worked on this task. And we asked the simple question, are we there yet? Can we actually achieve human-level transcription accuracy in this task using all of what we've learned in the past 20 years, bringing all the amazing technology and the resources and training data, computational capabilities that we have at this point together. And this involved two efforts. Number one, we had to measure human performance on this task. And this doesn't mean in some general sense, but actually on the very test data that we wanted to use. And then finally, we had to build the best possible recognition system with all the available technology up to that point. And then finally, of course, we wanted to analyze the results and gain a better understanding and hopefully lead us to the next challenge and direct our research efforts for the future. And I'll talk about all of this. So I'll start by giving you a bit of history of the task. I don't know, maybe I can ask who among you have had some acquaintance with conversational telephone speech recognition in the past? Okay, so some of you, but by no means everybody, so this is good. So I realized as I was reviewing the slides this morning, the word history is a bit presumptuous. I had the great fortune to visit a place of real history yesterday. We're talking about thousands of years, and here I'm talking about just a few decades. So please don't take this to be presumptuous. The history here is short, but this is the similarity. Your country is a place of encounter of many different cultures, faiths, and long lines of history that converged here. And the speech recognition community is a very eclectic community where lots of people work together to achieve a goal. not just to advance their own interests and their own goals or their own company, but actually to contribute to the common knowledge and to advance the field as a whole. And so this work that I'm briefly reviewing here is actually the effort of many, many places. People, of course, have moved between these different companies, research institutes, academic institutions. And NIST always assembles. NIST is the National Institute of Standard and Technology. It's an agency of the US Department of Commerce, and they actually conduct, they are charged with evaluating speech recognition technology and have been in the past. They assemble benchmark test sets, and then they track progress over time. And as you can see here, they have done that for different tasks. So some of you may be familiar with these. So there's the earliest attempts.
Anchorage.
Used very simple read speech, and then later moved on to planned speech. So something like ADAS.
Show me the one-way flights from Detroit to Westchester County.
So you can see people don't speak spontaneously. They're not reading, but they're thinking ahead of what they're going to say, and then it comes out as sort of a very fluent, evenly uttered utterance. Or, of course, plain read speech like Wall Street Journal.
The gold mines index fell 3.5 to 449.5.
So what the strategy of NIST is that they would make the task harder and harder over time. So the error rate would drop on one task, and then they would switch to the next task to reset it to a higher level, and then the performance on that would improve, meaning the error rate would fall until you move to the next task, and so forth. And so in the latter part of this whole history, the speech was spontaneous, conversational telephone speech. Telephone because it was easy to collect data from a large number of speakers over the telephone. You would basically sign people up, and then they would call into a system and participate in conversations. So there were two corpora, actually two versions of this task. One was called switchboard, where strangers were asked to converse on a topic.
Well, I have 3 children, and I've used various different kinds of daycare over the years. I think actually the hardest time to find good daycare is when your baby's very young.
Okay, so this was
most
the topic
of the teachers
daycare.
were just basically bent on either trying to discipline you and then force you to go through this material and show no really interest, into making it interesting or fun. Fun and school were two oxymoron type of words.
And then there was an even harder corpus called call home, where people were allowed to make free long-distance phone calls. This was in the days when giving people free long-distance phone calls was a financial incentive, okay, before everything became free. So, for example.
Man, your parents up for Arts Fest?
Things like that, just because, they don't want to pay me overtime or whatever. But if 9 o'clock strikes, I should be able to get out.
Okay, so it's a bit more unconstrained. People talk more at ease because they know the people at the other end. Okay, they sometimes utter half utterances that are then completed by the other people that they know. So it's a harder, as you will see, it's a much harder task. Okay. So prior work, actually, there was this whole period that DARPA actually funded researchers to work on this task, and that ended in 2004. When it was deemed no longer a good use of the government's money to spend on this task. At the time, the error rate on switchboard, this was when systems were based on Gaussian mixture models and HMMs, was about 15% on switchboard and more than double that on the call home task, 40%, something like that. In fact, the call home task had been abandoned a few years prior, so it didn't reflect the very latest technology at that point. Then we had a revolution in the field of automatic speech recognition. Deep neural networks came to be taking over the field, showing significant improvements over GMM-based models. And there was a landmark paper in 2011 when one of my colleagues, Frank Seide, and his colleagues demonstrated that actually if you applied the DNN acoustic modeling technology to switchboard, you could achieve a dramatic improvement in performance. And that kind of redirected people's attention to the switchboard task. And then there was a series of papers by a few people who had previously in the DARPA world worked on switchboard, namely the group at IBM and at Microsoft. And IBM published a series of papers, and as of late 2016, there was a very impressive improvement in performance at 6.6% word error rate on the switchboard task, which previously had been up there in the 14, 15%. So that was a big improvement. And also they quoted a number that had been bandied about for a while without too much examination, that the human error rate on this task was about 4%. And this was based on a citation in another paper. I'll talk about that some more. Okay, so here's the first real problem we have to address. What is the actual human error rate on this task? There was this rumor, I'll call it a rumor because it was based on a citation in a paper by Lippmann, 1997. The Lippmann paper actually examined human performance across a range of speech tasks, such as speaker recognition, language ID, and so forth. And they quoted the human performance at the time. You can see here the machine performance was about 40% on switchboard. This was ancient history, and they quoted 4% as the corresponding human performance. Okay, and if you dug into the paper a bit, it was based on a citation of Martin, 1996. Now, Martin actually referred to Alvin Martin, who was the head of the NIST group that evaluated these things at the time. And if you look in the references, it was based on personal communication. So someone asked Alvin, okay, so what are humans doing on this task? And it was maybe an educated guess. We don't know exactly. There was no actual data to back up this claim. But then in 2010, NIST actually published a study, this was at the LREC conference, where they did a systematic examination of the inter-transcriber agreement or disagreement for various tasks. And they did look at the CTS task. CTS is the NIST speak for conversational telephone speech. And they found that for very careful transcription, the disagreement among transcribers was between 4.1 and 4.5%. And if you did sort of a quick job, because at the time a big question was how can we transcribe lots of data very quickly, because we needed more data to advance the technology, they actually went as high as 9.6% to generate, to have more volume, transcription mode that was suitable for volume transcription. So this leads us to our own experiment. We took the latest publicly available NIST CTS evaluation set, which was the 2000 set, and we did a blind transcription test. Blind in the sense that the transcribers weren't told that this was data out of the ordinary, that was any different from what they were used to. We did have a transcription effort at Microsoft at the time for conversational speech, but it was conversational speech from the Skype platform. You all use Skype. Microsoft was developing a beta product at the time, which is on-the-fly translation of Skype conversations. So, of course, you need to do a good job transcribing them in the first place. So Skype data was being, some of the data that was being collected was being sent for transcription. So into that pipeline, which was carried out by a commercial transcription vendor, I won't name the names for legal reasons, but it was an industry standard transcription pipeline where two transcribers looked at every bit of speech. The speech was, by the way, chopped up into the utterances that were given in the test set, which is commensurate with what they do in their standard operating procedure. And then you had a first pass transcription, and then you had a second quality control pass where sometimes you would just correct errors from the first pass. So we just slipped our data, or rather the NIST data, into that pipeline and examined the output. And the results, here's the NIST study for comparison again. So the results that we found is that after we did some text normalization to minimize the mismatch between their transcription conventions and what the NIST references demanded. And then applying the standard NIST scoring software that some of you might be familiar with, SCLite and so forth, we found that the error rate on switchboard was 5.9% and on call home 11.3%. And so the 5.9% is a little bit above the very careful transcription study that NIST had done with a disagreement among human transcribers for very careful transcription. But of course, it wasn't the exact, it was similar data, but it was not the exact test data that NIST had examined. So it's expected to have some disagreement there, but it was in roughly the right ballpark. And then we found in this experiment that not only is machine transcription much harder on call home with the people who know each other than it is with the strangers talking to each other, but apparently the human transcription error for that type of data is also much harder. And the factor is about 2 in our experience. So here's a bit of history then. So we have this early estimate of 4% quoted by Lipman, but really ultimately due to personal communication from NIST. Then we have a NIST study, 2010, which puts it also in the 4% range. Then we have our own experiment that puts it a little bit higher than that, but that could be due to different data and maybe not as careful transcription as the NIST people did. And then there's actually a more recent study that was recently published on Archive by IBM folks. They did a more careful human transcription experiment with multiple independent transcribers and then picking the best transcriber for the task. Also, it wasn't a blind transcription study. The vendor was actually brought into the task and they were familiarized with the transcription conventions and so forth, which led to a 5.1% estimate. So, but we're clearly in the 4 to 5% range, 6% maybe, a range as a good estimate of human disagreement among transcriptions. Okay, so we have a good number now. So now let me spend a bit of time talking about the recognition system that we put together for this experiment. It breaks down into the standard sort of subsystems or sub-modules of modeling in a speech recognition system: acoustic modeling, language modeling, and then in our case we also do a fair bit of work on combining different systems, so system combination. This is sort of a highlight reel. So we wanted to really bring together the state-of-the-art technology for this task, which meant we used different kinds of neural network-based acoustic models, a different modeling architecture. We used actually 3 different convolutional network architectures, so-called ResNet, VGG, and something that we had developed internally called LACE. I will briefly summarize those in a bit. We also used a bidirectional long short-term memory architecture, long short-term memory, LSTM for short. And we use speaker adaptation using I-vectors and discriminative training using lattice-free paradigm. On the language modeling side, we used LSTMs as well. We used a different combination of different models by using different input representations, for example. I'll elaborate on that. And we built a lot of different acoustic models, and we combined them all at the hypothesis level that I'll talk about later, using confusion networks and weighted system combination. And this system overall achieved 5.8% word error rate on the switchboard portion and 11.0% on the call home portion. That's the highlight. So I could elaborate on each of these now, which I will do time permitting. So the state-of-the-art, of course, has a long history. Currently, convolutional neural nets are sort of, and LSTMs are the best that we know how to do. But this all goes back to early days of hybrid HMM neural net technology. Then the neural nets became deeper and deeper, and the performance got better and better. So again, in 2011, there was a paper by Frank Seide that showed that switchboard performance could be improved quite dramatically by going to deep neural nets. Now I'm going to have one slide on each of these neural network architectures that we use in acoustic modeling. So out of the vision world comes this notion of very deep convolutional nets with small receptive fields arranged in a deep hierarchy. These are called VGG networks, and this was adapted by IBM people to speech recognition. Seems to work very well. The aim is to achieve invariance to temporal and frequency shift. So it's basically you're viewing the time frequency plane as a two-dimensional image and applying a vision technology to model that. Then another type of convolutional neural net technology is the so-called ResNet, which is essentially a deep neural net where you add linear bypass connections to the layers so that you're not forcing the information to pass through nonlinearities. You just offer that as an option. ResNet stands for residual network. So you're essentially modeling the residual after you have the linearity, then the nonlinearity models the complement of that. So this gave us a good improvement over standard DNNs. In our final system, we no longer use DNNs because all these other architectures are so much better, but we sometimes use the DNN still as sort of a baseline for the acoustic model. And then we created our own version of, this is work by Dong Yu. I won't go into the details, but we added some features to the ResNet architecture, like attention masking, and that gave us some improvement. So we had 3 different convolutional neural net architectures: the ResNet, the VGG, and the LACE, to combine. All of these, this is a comparison, but I don't expect you to look at the details. Basically, these architectures look at about a half second of speech in each input window, and then they have a very deep hierarchy of layers with small convolutional patterns stacked on top of each other. The totally different approach to acoustic modeling that's also quite popular these days is the bidirectional LSTM, where actually information flows through time, through the network. So you train them with some version of backpropagation through time, and you combine a forward passing of information and the backward passing information, which is then combined at the output layer. As you can see here, they perform comparably to the convolutional nets, but we expect that they make different types of errors because it's quite a different architecture, and that we get a gain out of combining this with the CNN systems. Okay, the runtimes of these are, of course, you can only manage to train systems, any of these systems, using GPU hardware. So we use a toolkit called CNTK, originally called Computational Network Toolkit, but recently Microsoft rebranded it as the Cognitive Toolkit. Don't ask me why. But this allows us to actually train it on a large number of GPUs, even situated on different servers. It handles the communication among the different systems to achieve very reasonable training times. And the decoding is, if you look at the evaluation overhead of just the acoustic models, which is the 3rd line in this, it's all, it's quite reasonable, comparable to the actual decoding, to the effort in the search. Okay, adaptation. So we use the I vectors that came out of speaker recognition. It's a way to embed the speaker characteristics in a low-dimensional, typically about 100-dimensional vector space. You hope to capture the speaker characteristics in this low-dimensional space. And for acoustic modeling purposes, for speech recognition, what we do is we append the I vector to the individual frames that we get out of the feature front end, so that the network essentially can use that I vector as a global representation of the speaker, and it can subtract or compare or whatever it wants to do in order to normalize the local feature information with the global speaker information. And that is shown to help quite a bit. It leads to something like 5 to 10% relative improvement on the switchboard task. The other thing that we and other people do is lattice-free discriminative training. Everybody does discriminative training or sequence training, as it's called, with neural networks. What we decided to do is no longer use lattices for this, so we don't represent the hypothesis space that represents all the competitor hypotheses as in the form of a lattice. Instead, we just build basically a looping language model and encode that as a lattice that captures not just the likely hypotheses, but actually all possible competitor hypotheses. And when you cast this, the forward-backward computation in this model in a matrix, as a bunch of matrix multiplies, you can carry it out very efficiently on GPUs as well, and you no longer need to go through this trouble of generating lattices and then having to regenerate the lattices after you've done one round or a few rounds of discriminative training. You can just always use the full hypothesis space, essentially, to do the discriminative training. Here are the improvements we get on top of the I-vector adaptation. Another 8 to 14% on the switchboard task. Okay, now we come to language models. This is very familiar to people who have even worked in the old GMM paradigm. We do a progressive search, so we start with a simple language model, then we use a more powerful language model to do a second hypothesis evaluation pass, and this might be iterated a few times, and that's exactly what we do. So we use a pruned small n-gram model to decode and generate lattices. Then we rescore these lattices with a unpruned or nearly unpruned a large n-gram model to generate n-best lists. And then once we have the n-best lists, we can apply neural network language models to generate yet another set of language model scores for all the hypotheses. We started out working actually with RNN language models, so simple recurrent neural networks. And then more recently, we switched to LSTM language models with up to 3 layers of 1,000 units each. We play a few tricks. So for example, in the case of the RNNs, we found some gains simply by interpolating word-level probability estimates that we get from randomly, differently initialized networks. So we'd simply train not one estimator, but multiple estimators, or in this case, just 2. And they give slightly different estimates for each probability, and we just average them for a better estimate. For the case of the LSTM, we played around with different encodings of the input. The standard thing is to have a one-hot word representation, and then you learn an embedding representation from that. We had an alternate model that was encoding the words as a collection of letter trigrams. So that might help you because you're sort of building in some generalization due to morphology, like the word and its plural form would share a lot of trigrams, and that might help it. Lately we've been playing with character-based language models, but in this case we just used a word-based and a letter trigram-based model, and we interpolate their 2 estimates to get a better result. And then in all of these cases, when we have a neural network language model, we also interpolate the standard n-gram estimate as an additional interpolation source. Okay, so another trick we play is we want to use some out-of-domain data. We have this web data that was collected at the University of Washington based on some collaboration work that they did with ACID SRI. We find n-grams in the switchboard data that are high frequency, that essentially characterize the conversational style, and then we retrieve web data based on these high-frequency trigrams. That data is not quite perfectly matched to the domain, but it helps improve the results of the language model. Now, if we train all the data together, the in-domain and the out-of-domain, the network actually converges to something suboptimal because it verges too far from the target domain. So what we do is we train on all the data together, and then we do additional training iterations just on the in-domain data to focus the network back onto the target task. We train language models, identical language models in structure, both in the forward direction and in the backward direction, and we combine their estimates at the sentence level. So the log probability scores for the entire sentence from the forward model and the backward model are averaged or added up simply. And finally, since the neural network models are trained on a slightly smaller vocabulary because of computational demands, we end up with words that don't get very low frequency words are not covered by the neural network language model. We call these the OV words, but they're not really OV, they're just OV out of vocabulary for the neural network. So we simply, we want to estimate a penalty for those words because they are not treated in the neural network language model, so we simply count their number in each hypothesis, and then we attach a weight to that that's empirically estimated, so essentially we learn a penalty factor for the OV words in a hypothesis. That works better than giving some ad hoc probability estimate to those OV words. And then you can see here, by using all of techniques incrementally, we achieve an improvement that is from, goes from 7.6% to 6.9% for the RNN LMs, or if you then switch to LSTM LMs, you go down to 6.6%. So overall, we have about a 23% relative error reduction over the 4-gram LM. That's a huge gain, and it's very important to achieve state-of-the-art performance. This is just with a single acoustic model, with the ResNet convolutional neural net acoustic model, which is the single best model we had at the time. Okay, system combination. So here's what we do. We have all of these different acoustic models, and we run them each independently. We independently generate lattices for each acoustic model. Then we generate n-best lists for each acoustic model by expanding the lattices, and we rescore each of the n-best lists with the different language models that we have. And this finally leads us, and then we merge all of these n-best lists into a single confusion network. Who here knows about confusion networks? Okay. Confusion network is essentially what you see here. Some people call it a sausage because it looks kind of like a sausage over there on the right. It's essentially a special kind of lattice that was pinched to have a to only where all the arcs are lined up to line up all the different hypotheses that occur roughly in the same position of the utterance. So you achieve a single one-best hypothesis by walking through the sausage and picking the word hypothesis with the highest posterior probability at each position. And that should give you the word hypothesis with the lowest expected word error. The standard Bayesian paradigm for speech recognition, where you try to maximize the posterior probability at the sentence level, is actually theoretically only giving you the lowest. Okay, so here's how we build these confusion networks. So, oh no, this is actually, oh no, it shows the whole slide. Okay, great. So we have this array of systems that each give us n-best lists, and we get the combined scores from all our acoustic and language models attached to each hypothesis. Then we normalize these hypotheses and translate them back into a posterior probability space. So we get something that adds up to 1 for each n-best list. These are the posterior probabilities at the sentence level. Then we weight these because we've determined that some systems are more important than others. So we have this empirically optimized weights, system weights. So we multiply the posterior probabilities with a weight vector by the system weights, and we concatenate all the hypotheses together. And of course, when two hypotheses are the same in the words, we add up their posterior probabilities. And then we align these in a greedy multiple string alignment algorithm to come up with the column-wise representation where we have for each position all the word hypotheses and their corresponding posterior probabilities. So basically, the posterior probability of a word is the sum of all the posterior probabilities at the sentence level that run through that word. And then we just have to read off the words with the highest posterior at each position. Okay, and then it becomes very unwieldy because we have actually dozens of acoustic models. So we want to find a small subset of models that give us the best overall combination. So we do a greedy search by starting with the model with the highest best performance by itself, and then we look at all the possible ones we can add to that, and then we look for the third model that gives us the best improvement by adding it to the first two, and so forth. So we do a greedy search with a tool that we wrote, and that's actually part of the SRILM toolkit now. Okay, and furthermore, we have actually only limited amount of data to estimate all these weights for systems. So we want to inject some prior knowledge in order to minimize the number of free parameters in this process. So we actually have multiple bidirectional LSTM systems, and we know they're all about the same quality. So we actually pick the top 4 BLSTM systems and we combine them at a fixed weight into a single super BLSTM system. And then we combine that with all the other systems in this greedy search fashion. So that removes some free parameters and gives us good results. The data we used is we have about the standard. This is a standard training set that has been used by others. That's important to achieve comparable results. About 2,000 hours from the Fisher corpus, the switchboard corpus. We actually didn't bother to train on call home because it's only a few tens of hours and it doesn't really change the result very much or not worth the trouble. We added call home. Our consideration was not even on call home when we started this work. For some early work, we used only the 300-hour switchboard set, and it sometimes helps us even to use models that were trained only on the smaller data set because it adds some diversity to the model set. And then for the language model, we use the same corpus, Fisher switchboard, call home, the UW, University of Washington web data that I talked about before, and even broadcast news helps a little bit in the language model. Then we have various old development test sets from that DARPA program. We used the 2002 switchboard evaluation set as our development test set for the estimating system combination weights and so forth. And then, of course, the NIST 2000 set, which was the last public set that's available through LDC, became the eventual evaluation set. And this is a lot of numbers. I won't bother you go through all this, but you can see here that the best system gets a 6 point. This is a ResNet system on switchboard gets a 6.6% word error rate. On call home, about twice that, 12.5. You have a pretty constant 2-to-1 ratio in the errors on switchboard and call home. When you combine all the 4 BLSTM systems, you're already down to 6.0. Then when you do the full combination, you are down to 5.8. And this compares. It's essentially the same as the human transcription rate of 5.9. And similar for call home, 11.0, 11.3. Okay. So we conclude from this part of the experiment, well, okay, we kind of achieved our goal. We showed that with current technology, we can achieve human level transcription error on this test set. And that's important to know. But we wanted to go further than that. We want to understand how do they differ. Are they just the bottom line numbers are the same? Are they similar in other ways? Let's look at that. By the way, this would be a good time to answer any technical questions if you have any questions about just the recognition technology at that point. Otherwise, we can hold questions till the end. Okay. So we know the overall error rates. Yes?
How does this compare to the end-to-end neural network approach?
It's still a bit better than the end-to-end systems at this point. I would say maybe, I think the end-to-end system are coming close, maybe 1-2%, but it's still a ways off. We actually have an end-to-end system as well. We had a paper at ICASP on that, which at the time was the best reported result with end-to-end system, and we tried combining it as one of the many systems, but it did not improve the overall results, so we did not include it in our system here overall. But I'm sure the end-to-end systems are going to continue to get better, and eventually we'll learn how to build end-to-end systems that beat the HMM-based systems. Yes. Yes. Oh, it's just so you have a likelihood score from combining for each hypothesis, right? You have a likelihood score that combines the acoustic model score, the language model score, some word insertion penalty maybe, some pronunciation model score. So this is, you add them all together, you get a log likelihood score. So then you have to convert it to a probability and normalize it. Well, you divide it by some scaling factor to make the probabilities smoother, because otherwise you end up with all the probability mass on the top hypothesis. but you basically scale the log probabilities by dividing usually something like the language model factor, maybe 10. And then you exponentiate to get back into probability space, and then you normalize by the sum of all the scores over the entire n-best list, and that gives you a posterior probability estimate. Okay. So the research questions at this point is, what makes the transcription easy or hard? We know that some speakers are harder to recognize than others for machines. We have this sort of sheeps and goats terminology for some. We always know, oh, there's a speaker, he has a very high error rate, whatever. Others are very easy, they have a very low error rate. Is that similar for people and machines at this point? Because they have overall very similar transcription accuracy. Then the actual errors, the error patterns, what are the frequent word substitutions, deletions, insertions? Are those similar between people and machine, the transcription system we built? And finally, you might ask, if I present you with a human transcription and a machine transcription, can you, as a person who knows something about speech recognition, can you actually tell the difference? Okay? So those were three sort of operational questions that we wanted to ask in order to get at the differences between man and machine and human transcription quality. Okay. So here you see a scatter plot of the two corpora, switchboard on the left and call home on the right. Each dot represents a conversation side. Now, in this type of data, we can assume that the same speaker occurs on each side of the conversation. I mean, we don't have any speaker changes during the conversation. So each dot represents a speaker. And on the horizontal axis, we have the machine word error rate at that speaker level. And we have the human error rate on the y-axis. And we plot them against each other, and clearly there's a strong correlation. 0.65 and 0.73 for the two corpora. And each test set has 40 conversation sides, so we have 40 data points for each. However, you will notice that there is, on the call home side, there are the two dots that are filled in with red. They're kind of out there. What's going on with those? Those look like outliers. Well, at least one of them is. Well, if you look at it closely, these were two conversation sides where on one side of the call home conversation, there were actually multiple family members talking to the person calling in. And our recognition system had no idea that it was ever going to see two speakers. So all the speaker adaptation made an assumption about single speaker per conversation side. So when we remove those two outliers, the scale is different now. So it only goes up to 30% word error. So that improves the correlation actually to 0.80. So strong correlation on the speaker level between the machine and the human transcription. And what this means essentially is that whatever it is in the speech that makes it hard or easy to transcribe affects both humans and machines, which is reassuring. It means there's some underlying qualitative similarity in the degree of difficulty. Then there's actually a little known fact, which is kind of embarrassing, that on the switchboard portion of this test set, a majority of the speakers had been occurring in the training set. This was sort of a blunder by NIST. I don't know why they did this. You might argue, the training data for these speakers is so minuscule compared to the rest of the 2,000 hours that we're training on. Still, there had been a conjecture that the switchboard error was so much lower than the call home error, in part because they had these training speakers essentially in the test set, except for 4 speakers. 4 speakers did not occur in the training set. So we looked at the error for those 4 speakers, which are in the filled out dots here, relative to the overall distribution. And you can see that they're no different. There's maybe one, and if anything, the humans do worse on one of these unseen speakers. But of course the humans don't see a difference because they haven't seen the training set. They're just using all the training data that they've acquired during their lifetimes. So this is clearly not a factor in this particular switchboard training set. So we could discard this conjecture about unseen versus seen speakers in the switchboard set as a big factor in the quality of the transcription on the machine end. Now let's look at the qualitative differences when it comes to the actual type of errors. So by type of errors, I mean the actual words occurring as substitutions, deletions, and insertions. So the NIST scoring program actually has an option to output the number of occurrences for different substitution errors, for example. And you rank them by their frequency, and you can see the list here for human versus ASR, separately for call home and switchboard. And the first thing, first of all, terminology. So this token % hesitation is just a text normalized version of and the so-called hesitation or filled pause words that occur in conversation. And then the other special token, %BCAK, stands for back channel acknowledgements. Those are the words in English that are usually realized as mm-hmm. This is what you say to signal to your conversant partner that they should keep talking, that you're listening, but they should keep talking. So these lists here, you see that the most frequent substitutions involve short function words like is, oh, it, so forth. So they're quite similar, but we noticed one outlier, which is the one circled in red here. The ASR system makes a frequent, actually by far the most frequent substitution is where a hesitation is misrecognized as a back channel acknowledgement. So is recognized as Okay, maybe in some context phonetically that makes that more likely. These words are acoustically confusable, but the interesting thing is that humans do not make that confusion nearly as often. It appears much farther down the list for humans. And if you think about it, these two special words, they actually have a discourse or a dialogue management function. I use a filled pause in conversation to indicate that I want to speak, but I'm still thinking about what I'm going to say. It's used to claim the floor. If the other person's speaking, I might butt in and say, okay. Or if I already have the turn, I might just signal that I'm thinking, but I want to retain the turn. So that's what filled pauses do. Now think about what back-channel acknowledgements are. They signal that the other person should keep talking. I'm listening, but the other person should keep talking. So it's actually, it confirms the current floor assignment. The other person has the floor. So from a linguistic pragmatics point of view, these two words have opposite meaning, but they're both together very useful or actually essential to manage the floor in a two-person or multi-person conversation. And you might, this is conjecture, but you might argue that, and they are distinguished, these words are actually distinguished by not just phonetics, but also prosody and of course context, conversational context. And humans obviously are very good at telling the difference, because it's so essential to manage the conversation. Machines, on the other hand, are terrible, as you can see here, relatively speaking. I mean, these are not a huge number of errors, but they are among the most frequent types of errors. Okay, just to complete that comparison, we have the top insertions and top deletions, top insertions, and here we see very, very similar patterns. It's the short function words that get both inserted and deleted. So from this qualitative point of view, the two systems are quite similar. Okay, so we had a bit of fun with this by answering the final question, wanting to at least get at it in an informal way. We built a little Turing experiment. We built a demo for the last ICASP conference where we put up on the screen an utterance with the reference transcription in the middle, and on one side, the human transcription, on the other side, the machine transcription, but without telling people which is which. So randomly, the system would put the machine transcription on one side or the other side, okay? And then the human subject would have to click to indicate which one they thought was the human transcription. And we call that spot the bot. The bot being the human, being the machine transcription system. And if you get it right, it's one in your favor. It's one score in your favor. If you get it wrong, it's one score in the machine's favor. Okay? So it's a fun game. I don't know if we have time to play it for just a few rounds. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna since we have many subjects here in the room, so you can read the utterance. This is the reference transcription.
Yeah, they're financed at a pretty low interest rate most of the time, aren't they?
I can play again if you want.
Yeah, they're financed at a pretty low interest rate most of the time, aren't they?
Okay. Now you see the two transcriptions here. And I won't tell you which is which, of course. The little square bracket here means there was a deletion. Anything that's uppercase is an error. Okay. So you see here, there's two error regions. There's actually the same error region, but the exact error that was made is slightly different. Okay. So maybe we should do this by a vote. Who thinks that the human transcription is on the left? Okay. Who thinks the human transcription is on the right? Okay, that's, I think, the majority. All right, let's figure this out. So we click on the right. Oh, hopefully my server. Oh, you got it correct. Very good. Very good. Very good. Okay, this is kind of a degenerate example. I'm not sure this is. Well, we can do it.
You got it.
Okay, so it's kind of a very quick rendition of two words. So there's a difference here, but one of them got it completely correct. The other system just didn't get it all. So after you delete any like hesitations are actually removed before scoring because the NIST score treats them as optional. So which do you think, this is probably a random choice here, but not knowing anything about the recognition system, but which do you think is the human transcription, the left? Raise your hand if you think it's the left. Okay, who thinks it's on the right? Okay, I don't know. Let's give it the, too bad. Anyway, so we could play this later if you want, if it's fun. So we just put this up at ICASP, and it was a big, it was very popular, I have to say. People had fun with this. This is a long one. Let's, in the interest of time, let's defer this till later. Go back to the presentation. Okay, so so what was the result? Out of 353 trials, people got it right 53% of the time. Okay, which is indistinguishable from chance, statistically speaking. I must say there were a few people who were very good at it, but then some people were just terrible at it. And I wouldn't say that all the speech researchers were good at it. I myself, I think I can't do better than chance. So obviously this was not a strictly rigorously controlled human subject experiment, but it was an informal experiment and it gave us some glimpse. Most of all for us as the researchers working on this task, it was instructive to just play this game for a bit because it just made it clear to us how hard it is to really tell the difference, even knowing the recognition system, having built the recognition system ourselves. Okay, so let me wrap up now. So we can extend this chart from NIST a little bit. So we have the human performance down there it was 5.9%, which is statistically no different from our system at 5.8%, but we've clearly come a long way. It took a while, you know, from 2000, mid-2000s to 1 decade or more later. But I think it's an achievement for the community. We measured the human transcription error to between 5 and 6%, which is by and large in agreement with what NIST had measured before on a different data set, and also similar to what other people recently did in a human transcription experiment. By putting together the state-of-the-art technology without even inventing very much new stuff, just doing things carefully, using all the training data, we achieve that human level of transcription. And then when we compare the human and the machine transcriptions, we can say that they are really, really close in terms of where they go wrong. The actual types of errors are very similar, with that one interesting exception that concerns the distinction between filled pauses and back-channel acknowledgements. Very striking, the very high correlation at the speaker level between human and machine error. Meaning that whatever underlying factors, you know, dialect, acoustic quality, whatever those factors are that make a speaker easy or hard, for the machine also makes them easy or hard for the human transcriber. So where do we go from here? Well, we need to pick a harder task. that's what we've been doing for decades now. And our current focus is on meeting transcription, being Microsoft, where we want to improve productivity of people in the business world as well as in the private world. Meetings and Skype conversations and so forth. That's a big area. So we're working on transcribing scenarios where we have multiple speakers, sometimes talking over each other, captured with a variety of microphones, typically of low quality, at a distance. So those are much harder tasks. If you run the current systems, the error rate jumps by a factor of 2 easily. So that's one of the possible harder tasks. But I think it's a worthwhile task, and it's been working so far for us that we push the technology further and further. And so at this point, I want to thank you. We have a webpage where we summarize our work, have the publications and so forth, if you are interested in reading more about it. And of course, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Hi. You showed that the machine has problem distinguishing between field pauses and back channel pauses.
Yeah.
So it could be a possible future research area. So
absolutely.
Assuming that I'm interested in this area, what would be your recommendation to go? How would you go about that?
I mentioned two sources of information that humans presumably use that we are currently not using. One is context. Modeling the entire dialogue context. What did the other person say at the same time, both before and after the utterance in question? That would be important because, for instance, if the previous utterance was such that the turn was actually meant to change. So, for instance, I ask a question, right? Then after I ask a question, I'm willing to give up my turn, and I expect the turn to change to the other speaker. In such a situation, you would not expect a back-channel acknowledgement because back-channel acknowledgement signals that the other person should continue talking. But if it's my turn to talk, then I don't use a back-channel.
Right.
Okay? So context is important, and also prosodic quality. So the filled pause is usually, when it's used to take over the floor or secure the floor, it's usually the pitch and the energy level stay sort of high and flat, but back channels are usually uttered with low vocal effort because again they are supposed to be non-intrusive. You don't want to take over the floor. You just want to signal the other person that they should talk. So there should. I mean, I haven't studied this in detail, but there should be prosodic differences. So if we wanted to build a prosodic feature model of the different these different words, or actually really dialogue acts, if we want to build a dialogue act model, then we should definitely include prosodic features.
Thanks. It may be worthwhile to add the human transcription to the fusion. But my question is that the speaker recognition competition, we saw that when there was mismatch conditions, the degradation of neural networks of DNNs are much bigger than for other systems. Do you observe such things in speech recognition?
I cannot. First of all, we have not. This corpus is relatively homogeneous in terms of acoustic conditions. Later, there was they added, for instance, cellular data to the CTS domain, but this test set is all landline data. Also, there's all the 2000 test set, as far as I know, is all native speakers of American English. So you don't have any non-native English, for example, which would create a mismatch. But if you expand, I can't answer the question because I don't have the data, but I would expect to find more degradation, whether in machines or with neural networks or with older technology. I don't know. I think you would have some breakdown no matter what. But clearly the two big factors are, channel. If you get cellular versus landline, that typically creates some mismatch. And then also, of course, the cellular quality can be very, very variable. And then the big factor is non-native speech. So non-native speech typically almost doubles the word error rate in my experience, but not in this test set because it doesn't have any non-native speakers. Yeah.
Is there anything from this research that is available for use for CALD users?
This is a research system, so we have when you use Microsoft Speech Services to speech enable your application, you don't get the system. you get something very similar to like a you get a CNN system or a BLSTM system with a standard language model. You don't even get, I don't think you get an LSTM language model with the commercial system that we have. But we're actually working on transitioning some of this. I mean, you clearly when you have combined 6 different systems and then you add one more, the incremental gain is very small. So from a commercial point of view, it would not be a smart thing to do to run 10 different systems in parallel and combine them. You would maybe have 1 or at most 2 systems because that's where you see the biggest improvement when you combine the first 2 systems. So I can't promise anything, but I mean fundamentally it's a similar technology. It's just sort of pushed a little bit further in this experiment. Okay, I think we're supposed to wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.